Paper 185. The Trial before Pilate. Shortly after 6 o'clock on this Friday morning, April 7, A.D. 30, Jesus was brought before Pilate, the Roman procurator, who governed Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, under the immediate supervision of the legatus of Syria. The Master was taken into the presence of the Roman governor by the temple guards, bound, and was accompanied by about 50 of his accusers, including the Sanhedrist court, principally Sadduceans, Judas Iscariot, and the high priest Caiaphas, and by the apostle John. Annas did not appear before Pilate. Pilate was up and ready to receive this group of early morning callers, having been informed by those who had secured his consent the previous evening to employ the Roman soldiers in arresting the Son of Man, that Jesus would be early brought before him. This trial was arranged to take place in front of the Praetorium, in addition to the fortress of Antonia, where Pilate and his wife made their headquarters when stopping in Jerusalem. Though Pilate conducted much of Jesus' examination within the Praetorium halls, the public trial was held outside on the steps leading up to the main entrance. This was a concession to the Jews, who refused to enter any Gentile building where leaven might be used on this day of preparation for the Passover. Such conduct would not only render them ceremonially unclean, and thereby debar them from partaking of the afternoon feast of thanksgiving, but would also necessitate their subjection to purification ceremonies after sundown, before they would be eligible to partake of the Passover supper. Although these Jews were not at all bothered in conscience as they intrigued to effect the judicial murder of Jesus, they were none the less scrupulous regarding all these matters of ceremonial cleanness and traditional regularity. And these Jews have not been the only ones to fail in the recognition of high and holy obligations of a divine nature, while giving meticulous attention to things of trifling importance to human welfare in both time and eternity. 1. Pontius Pilate. If Pontius Pilate had not been a reasonably good governor of the minor provinces, Tiberius would hardly have suffered him to remain as procurator of Judea for 10 years. Although he was a fairly good administrator, he was a moral coward. He was not a big enough man to comprehend the nature of his task as governor of the Jews. He failed to grasp the fact that these Hebrews had a real religion, a faith for which they were willing to die, and that millions upon millions of them, scattered here and there throughout the empire, looked to Jerusalem as the shrine of their faith, and held the Sanhedrin in respect as the highest tribunal on earth. Pilate did not love the Jews, and this deep-seated hatred early began to manifest itself. Of all the Roman provinces, none was more difficult to govern than Judea. Pilate never really understood the problems involved in the management of the Jews, and, therefore, very early in his experience as governor, made a series of almost fatal and well-nigh suicidal blunders. And it was these blunders that gave the Jews such power over him. When they wanted to influence his decisions, all they had to do was to threaten an uprising, and Pilate would speedily capitulate. And this apparent vacillation, or lack of moral courage, of the procurator was chiefly due to the memory of a number of controversies he had had with the Jews, and because in each instance they had worsted him. The Jews knew that Pilate was afraid of them, that he feared for his position before Tiberius, and they employed this knowledge to the great disadvantage of the governor on numerous occasions. Pilate's disfavor with the Jews came about as a result of a number of unfortunate encounters. First, he failed to take seriously their deep-seated prejudice against all images as symbols of idol worship. Therefore, he permitted his soldiers to enter Jerusalem without removing the images of Caesar from their banners, as had been the practice of the Roman soldiers under his predecessor. A large deputation of Jews waited upon Pilate for 5 days, imploring him to have these images removed from the military standards. He flatly refused to grant their petition, and threatened them with instant death. Pilate, himself being a skeptic, did not understand that men of strong religious feelings will not hesitate to die for their religious convictions, and therefore was he dismayed when these Jews drew themselves up defiantly before his palace, bowed their faces to the ground, and sent word that they were ready to die. Pilate then realized that he had made a threat which he was unwilling to carry out. He surrendered, ordered the images removed from the standards of his soldiers in Jerusalem, and found himself from that day on, to a large extent, subject to the whims of the Jewish leaders. who had in this way discovered his weakness in making threats which he feared to execute. Pilate subsequently determined to regain this lost prestige, and accordingly had the shields of the emperor, such as were commonly used in Caesar worship, put up on the walls of Herod's palace in Jerusalem. When the Jews protested, he was adamant. When he refused to listen to their protests, they promptly appealed to Rome, and the emperor as promptly ordered the offending shields removed. And then was Pilate held in even lower esteem than before. Another thing which brought him into great disfavor with the Jews was that he dared to take money from the temple treasury to pay for the construction of a new aqueduct to provide increased water supply for the millions of visitors to Jerusalem at the times of the great religious feasts. The Jews held that only the Sanhedrin could disperse the temple funds, and they never ceased to inveigh against Pilate for this presumptuous ruling. No less than a score of riots and much bloodshed resulted from this decision. The last of these serious outbreaks had to do with the slaughter of a large company of Galileans, even as they worshipped at the altar. It is significant that, while this vacillating Roman ruler sacrificed Jesus to his fear of the Jews and to safeguard his personal position, he finally was deposed as a result of the needless slaughter of Samaritans in connection with the pretensions of a false Messiah who led troops to Mount Gerizim, where he claimed the temple vessels were buried, and fierce riots broke out when he failed to reveal the hiding place of the sacred vessels as he had promised. As a result of this episode, the legatus of Syria ordered Pilate to Rome. Tiberius died while Pilate was on the way to Rome, and he was not reappointed as procurator of Judea. He never fully recovered from the regretful condemnation of having consented to the crucifixion of Jesus. Finding no favor in the eyes of the new emperor, he retired to the province of Lausanne, where he subsequently committed suicide. Claudia Procula, Pilate's wife, had heard much of Jesus through the word of her maid-in-waiting, who was a Phoenician believer in the gospel of the kingdom. After the death of Pilate, Claudia became prominently identified with the spread of the good news. And all this explains much that transpired on this tragic Friday forenoon. It is easy to understand why the Jews presumed to dictate to Pilate to get him up at 6 o'clock to try Jesus, and also why they did not hesitate to threaten to charge him with treason before the emperor if he dared to refuse their demands for Jesus' death. A worthy Roman governor, who had not become disadvantageously involved with the rulers of the Jews, would never have permitted these bloodthirsty religious fanatics to bring about the death of a man whom he himself had declared to be innocent of their false charges, and without fault. Rome made a great blunder, a far-reaching error in earthly affairs, when she sent the second-rate Pilate to govern Palestine. Tiberius had better have sent to the Jews the best provincial administrator in the empire. 2. Jesus appears before Pilate. When Jesus and his accusers had gathered in front of Pilate's judgment hall, the Roman governor came out and, addressing the company assembled, asked, "What accusation do you bring against this fellow?" The Sadducees and counselors who had taken it upon themselves to put Jesus out of the way had determined to go before Pilate and ask for confirmation of the death sentence pronounced upon Jesus, without volunteering any definite charge. Therefore did the spokesman for the Sanhedrist court answer Pilate, "If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up to you." When Pilate observed that they were reluctant to state their charges against Jesus, although he knew they had been all night engaged in deliberations regarding his guilt, he answered them, "Since you have not agreed on any definite charges, why do you not take this man and pass judgment on him in accordance with your own laws?" Then spoke the clerk of the Sanhedrin court to Pilate, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death, and this disturber of our nation is worthy to die for the things which he has said and done. Therefore have we come before you for confirmation of this decree." To come before the Roman governor with this attempted evasion discloses both the ill will and the ill humor of the Sanhedrists toward Jesus, as well as their lack of respect for the fairness, honor, and dignity of Pilate. What effrontery for these subject citizens to appear before their provincial governor asking for a decree of execution against a man before affording him a fair trial, and without even preferring definite criminal charges against him. Pilate knew something of Jesus' work among the Jews, and he surmised that the